August 1945, the sun hung low over the smoldering ruins of Tokyo. The war that had consumed the Pacific for nearly 4 years was unraveling faster than anyone could comprehend. From the shattered factories of Yokohama to the quiet rice fields of Kyushu, a silence had fallen, not of peace but of disbelief. Japan, once so certain of victory, now faced whispers of something incomprehensible, a weapon unlike any the world had ever known. Inside a converted detention compound near Manila, a group of captured Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and communications officers, sat in stunned quiet, the humid air pressed against the wooden walls as they listened to the faint crackle of a U.S. Army radio. An American interpreter repeated the words that would forever mark human history: Hiroshima, destroyed by a single bomb. The women froze. Some turned pale, others shook their heads in denial. They had heard tales of Allied bombing raids, the firestorms over Osaka, the nightly destruction of cities. But this was different. One bomb. How could such a thing exist? They whispered among themselves, searching for logic, for reason, for any trace of military possibility. None came. Through the barred windows, the sound of rain began to fall, a slow, heavy rhythm that mingled with their growing realization. This was no ordinary weapon. It was a force that defied every law of war they had been taught to believe. The weapon that would end the war had arrived, and it was beyond imagination. The news of Hiroshima's destruction spread through the prisoner of war camps like a storm crossing the Pacific. It began as a whisper, uncertain, fragile, and impossible to believe. Within hours, that whisper turned into a wave of shock that reached every corner of the Allied detention centers scattered across the Philippines, Okinawa, and the Marianas. But for the Japanese women imprisoned at the American-run compound near Manila, the news carried a weight that no soldier, no captive, could easily bear. These women were not frontline fighters. Many had served as clerks, nurses, and radio operators. They had tended to the wounded, copied coded orders, and believed, as so many did, that Japan's spirit could never be broken. Yet now, inside that humid camp surrounded by palm trees and barbed wire, the air itself seemed to thicken with disbelief. They had heard the rumors before: new American machines, devastating air raids, firebombs that turned cities into oceans of flame. They had lived through the sound of engines roaring overhead, of night skies glowing red with burning homes. But nothing in their understanding of war, nothing in their long-held faith in Japanese resilience, could explain what the Americans now said had happened at Hiroshima. A single bomb, they were told, had destroyed an entire city. Not in a night of bombing, not through 100 aircraft, but one bomb, one explosion, one blinding moment that ended everything. The words hung in the air like a curse. In the mess hall that afternoon, the usual chatter was gone. Even the sound of cutlery and plates seemed distant, muffled by the weight of what had been said. The women sat at wooden tables, their khaki uniforms faded and wrinkled from months in captivity. The fans turned lazily overhead, doing little to cut through the thick tropical heat. A few American guards stood near the door, speaking in low voices. There was no laughter, no triumph. The tone was subdued, as though even they struggled to process what the world had just witnessed. One of the guards, a young man from Ohio who often served as a translator, approached their table holding a small radio receiver. He spoke slowly, carefully, repeating the words that had been broadcast that morning. A single bomb, dropped on Hiroshima, has destroyed nearly the entire city. The Japanese women stared at him unmoving, Some frowned, thinking they had misunderstood. Others exchanged quick glances, searching each other's faces for confirmation. The translator continued, "The weapon is called an atomic bomb." That phrase, atomic bomb, meant nothing to them yet. It sounded almost unscientific, like something from myth. One of the older women, a former nurse who had served in Burma, whispered under her breath, "Hitori no Bakudan de Machi ga Kiru." A city disappears with one bomb. Her voice trembled with disbelief. Another younger woman shook her head. "Impossible," she said quietly, echoing the word that would soon become the reaction of an entire nation. The translator didn't argue. He simply set the radio on the table, allowing them to hear the crackling American voice describe what had happened. The intense heat, the blinding flash, the mushroom cloud rising into the sky. Outside, the tropical rain began to fall. The drops hit the corrugated tin roof in slow, rhythmic patterns, drowning the silence inside. For a few moments, the only sounds were the radio's static and the rain's steady drumming. The women looked down at their hands, at the dull reflection of the light on the wooden table. No one spoke. It was as if words had lost meaning altogether. One of the prisoners later recalled how the guard had turned off the radio and stood still for a moment, as if unsure whether to say more. Then, almost apologetically, he said, "They say even the shadows were burned into the ground." He didn't say it with pride or satisfaction, only quiet disbelief. The women stared at him. One of them, her eyes filling with tears, whispered, "Kami no Chikara," the power of the gods. The guards, too, seemed unsettled. They had fought in the jungles, seen death and destruction beyond comprehension, yet this was different. That night, they gathered near their quarters, talking in low tones about the reports filtering through command. Some were relieved, believing this new weapon might finally end the endless killing. Others looked uneasy, wondering what kind of future could begin from such horror. Back in the women's barracks, the atmosphere was heavy with thought. The flickering lantern light cast shifting shadows on the walls. A few prisoners tried to write letters, though none knew if they would ever be sent. Others sat in silence, their faces turned toward the darkened windows, listening to the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the horizon. Among them was Lieutenant K, a communications officer who had once worked in a Tokyo command post. She had seen the results of American firebombings, entire districts reduced to ash. And yet, even she could not comprehend the scale of what was being described. She thought of her family, of the streets she had walked as a child. Hiroshima was a name that everyone knew, a city of students, merchants, and soldiers. The idea that it could vanish in an instant seemed to defy reason itself. By the following morning, the camp was buzzing with restrained tension. The Americans had confirmed it. Hiroshima was gone. Nearly 80,000 people, perhaps more, were dead. The Japanese women gathered in small circles, whispering prayers under their breath. Some still refused to believe. "It's propaganda," one said. "No weapon can do that." But others had seen the way the guards spoke, the solemnity in their voices. It was no propaganda. It was truth. The compound's commander, a fair but stern major, addressed them through an interpreter later that day. His tone was calm, almost formal. He told them the weapon was new, that it used the energy of atoms, invisible particles, to unleash unimaginable power. His voice carried across the courtyard, blending with the sound of cicadas humming in the nearby trees. "The war will end soon," he said, "because this bomb has changed everything." And with that, silence returned once more. In the days that followed, conversations shifted from disbelief to reflection. Some of the women began to question not the Americans, but their own understanding of war. "If the gods allowed this," one said, "then perhaps we were wrong to think honor alone could save us." It was a thought few dared to speak aloud. Others clung desperately to loyalty, insisting that Japan would never surrender, that even this could be endured. But deep down, they knew something fundamental had changed. The Americans, too, moved with a strange stillness. The guards continued their routines. Inspections, meals, radio broadcasts. Yet their expressions were thoughtful, even mournful. The destruction of Hiroshima was not something to celebrate. It was something to endure. At night, when the tropical wind rustled through the palm leaves, some of the women could hear faint strains of music coming from the guards' quarters. Slow, melancholic tunes played on a harmonica or a gramophone. It gave the camp an oddly human sound, fragile, uncertain, and deeply tired. Days turned into weeks, and still the talk of the bomb lingered. More news came. Tokyo in confusion, survivors describing burns that no medicine could treat, a city turned to grey dust. The Americans showed no triumph. They treated the subject as though it were sacred or cursed. The Japanese women, in turn, began to see their captors differently. The Americans were still the enemy, but they were also human beings grappling with the same incomprehensible truth. The war, it seemed, had reached a point beyond victory or defeat. In quiet moments, some prisoners would sit near the wire fence and look out toward the distant mountains, their minds returning again and again to that word, impossible. For years they had been told Japan could never lose. For years they had believed that devotion and sacrifice could overcome any weapon, any nation. But now, even the most devout among them understood that the world had changed forever. That night, the rain returned. It came harder this time, washing over the camp, hammering against the tin roofs, running down the wooden walls in thick streams. Thunder rolled across the sky, and lightning flashed, illuminating the faces of the women huddled together in their bunks. None spoke. The war outside was nearing its end, but inside another battle, one of faith, of identity, of comprehension, had just begun. Days later, as the first light of morning broke through the grey clouds over the camp, another broadcast arrived, quieter, but somehow heavier. The voices on the American radio were different now, more solemn. The Japanese women gathered near the small wooden table where the radio sat, the same place they had first heard the name Hiroshima. The interpreter adjusted the dial until the signal steadied, and then spoke in a low, careful tone. "The same type of bomb has been dropped on Nagasaki." For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Others simply froze, unable to process what they had heard. One of them whispered, "Nagasaki. Are you sure?" The interpreter nodded. His expression carried no pride, only fatigue. He repeated the details from the broadcast: destruction beyond measure, thousands dead, fires still burning. The Japanese prisoners exchanged looks of disbelief. To them, Nagasaki wasn't just another city. Many had family there. One woman, a nurse named Haruko, clutched the edge of the table, her face paling. Her younger brother had been stationed there as a mechanic for the Navy. Another, a quiet clerk from Kyushu, closed her eyes. Her father had worked in one of Nagasaki's shipyards. No one cried right away. It was as though the heart needed time to understand what the mind could not accept. The same horror that had struck Hiroshima had now struck again. And if it could happen twice, then it could happen anywhere. Even Tokyo. Even the Emperor's palace. Later that day, the Americans brought in a stack of newspapers for the guards. Though the papers were English-language editions, the photographs needed no translation. Blackened ruins, twisted metal, the ghostly outlines of streets that no longer existed. A few guards shared the papers with the Japanese women, not out of cruelty, but because they believed the truth should be seen. The women crowded around, their eyes scanning the grainy images. What they saw silenced even the most skeptical among them. One photograph showed a group of survivors standing in a wasteland of ash. Their clothes hung in tatters, their faces burned, their eyes hollow. Another showed what had once been a city center, now flattened, a sea of debris stretching to the horizon. A third image captured something almost beyond comprehension, the shadow of a man burned into a concrete wall, the only trace of a life vaporized in an instant. It was then that Haruko began to tremble. Her hands shook as she whispered, "Kami no Ikari," the wrath of the gods. The phrase spread through the room, repeated in hushed voices. It was not said in superstition, but in terror. How could any human being make such a thing? To them this power felt divine, or worse, infernal. As the day went on, the emotional weight of what they'd seen began to break through the numbness. Several of the women retreated to their bunks, clutching their personal belongings. A photograph, a letter, a keepsake, as if those fragile pieces of the past could protect them from a world that had just changed forever. The camp, once noisy with the routines of captivity, fell into an eerie stillness. Even the guards moved quietly, aware that something irreversible had entered the hearts of their prisoners. That night, candles flickered weakly in the barracks. The humid air carried the faint smell of wax and wood smoke. The women sat close together, speaking in whispers. Some prayed. Others simply stared at the floor, lost in thoughts they could not voice. Haruko knelt beside her cot, holding a letter from home. The ink had faded, but she traced each character with her fingertip. Her brother's words from a year earlier, full of optimism, full of the belief that Japan would endure anything. Now, that belief felt like a relic from another life. In a corner, the camp's interpreter sat listening to the radio again. The American voices were discussing surrender, speculation, and the possibility that the emperor himself might speak to his people. When he translated these words to the prisoners, a murmur spread through them. The emperor speaking publicly. It was unthinkable. The Son of Heaven did not address ordinary people, and certainly not to discuss defeat. But deep down, they knew that moment was coming. The scale of destruction had broken, even the unbreakable. For generations, these women had been taught that Japan's strength came from its spirit, from endurance, loyalty, and sacrifice. But now, that spirit faced something it could not fight, a weapon that could erase cities faster than any army could march. The traditional code of Bushido, the warrior's path, meant nothing against atomic fire. Their faith in resilience began to crumble beneath the weight of scientific power. Outside, the night insects sang in the grass, oblivious to human grief. The guards, unable to sleep, smoked cigarettes under the dim glow of lanterns. They didn't talk about victory. They talked about the future, uncertain and frightening. One of them, a veteran from Saipan, said quietly, "If this is what winning looks like, I don't know if it's worth it." His words, though never translated, seemed to hang in the air, reaching across the invisible divide between captor and captive. By morning, news had traveled quickly. Nagasaki was gone. The Japanese government was said to be in chaos. Some prisoners whispered that the end was near. Others refused to believe it. "The emperor will fight," said one woman. "He must." But no one answered. The conviction in her voice had vanished. The Americans, meanwhile, carried themselves differently, not boastfully, but with a heavy awareness that they had witnessed the dawn of something beyond war itself. In the following days, the camp's routines continued, though each action felt mechanical, hollow. The guards brought food, called roll, escorted groups to work detail. The prisoners complied in silence. No one laughed anymore. Even the smallest noises, the creak of wooden floors, the clang of metal plates, seemed louder against the weight of what had happened. In the evenings, the women gathered again in the barracks. They spoke of their families, of the lives they had lost touch with, of cities that might no longer exist. Haruko, her eyes red from sleepless nights, confessed that she dreamed of fire, not the kind that burned, but the kind that consumed everything without sound or warning. She wasn't alone. Others nodded, their faces pale in the candlelight. They too dreamed of the flash. Then came a rumor that a third bomb was ready, waiting to be dropped if Japan did not surrender. The Americans never confirmed it, but the suggestion alone was enough to break the last thread of defiance in many hearts. What point was there in loyalty, in courage, if the very earth could be turned to dust in a single breath? That night, a storm rolled in from the sea. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked like artillery. The women huddled close, some praying, others whispering fragments of home addresses, as if saying them aloud could keep those places alive. Haruko's candle flickered, then died, leaving only darkness and the faint sound of sobbing. By the time the rain stopped, the camp was drenched in silence. The air smelled of wet earth and despair. Morning light crept in slowly, revealing tired faces and tear-streaked cheeks. The interpreter read the latest bulletin. Japan's cities were on the brink of collapse. The government was preparing to communicate directly with the Allies. The war's end, he said, was close, perhaps only days away. The women didn't cheer. There was no sense of relief, only the quiet ache of realization. The nation they had devoted everything to, their youth, their faith, their families, had reached its breaking point. And it had not been defeated by armies, but by a single invention. A force that no warrior could resist, no emperor could command, no god could undo. They sat together that day, under the heavy Manila sun, their khaki uniforms clinging to their skin, and they stared at the distant horizon. Somewhere beyond that sky, their homeland was in ruins. Somewhere beyond it, the future had begun, one where the old world had ended in a flash of light. As night fell, Haruko placed her brother's letter beneath her pillow and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for mercy. Around her, others did the same. The camp, for once, was utterly still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The next morning, the guards raised the American flag as usual, but even they did it with subdued motion. The war was not yet over, but something far greater had already ended. The illusion that humanity could fight endlessly without consequence. For the women in that camp, Nagasaki was more than a name. It was the moment the impossible became real, when loyalty gave way to loss and war revealed its final, merciless truth. When the war finally ended, it did not arrive with the roar of aircraft or the thunder of artillery. It came instead through a radio speaker, small and tinny, set atop a wooden table in the center of the American POW camp. The women were ordered to assemble that morning, August 15, 1945. The air was thick and unmoving, heavy with tropical heat. A faint wind carried the smell of damp earth and rust from the barbed wire fences. The guard stood in silence as an American officer adjusted the radio dial, the faint crackle of static filling the compound. No one knew exactly what they were about to hear, but every face, Japanese and American alike, seemed to understand that this would be no ordinary announcement. The interpreter, a young man from California who spoke fluent Japanese, turned to the prisoners and said softly, "Your emperor will speak." At first, the word seemed absurd. The emperor, the divine voice of Japan, was never heard by ordinary citizens, much less prisoners of war. But then it happened. From the radio came a distant, fragile voice, slow, deliberate, and almost ghostly. The prisoners leaned forward, straining to hear through the static. The tone was unfamiliar, formal, poetic, and sorrowful. The emperor spoke not of victory, but of ending the war, of enduring the unendurable, of bearing the unbearable. The translator's voice broke slightly as he repeated the message in English. Japan had accepted defeat. A stillness fell over the camp unlike anything that had been felt before. The women stood motionless, eyes lowered. Some trembled. Others closed their eyes as if to block out the meaning of what they'd just heard. The guards didn't move either. Even they seemed unwilling to break the silence. After years of relentless fighting, of endless death and loss, the war had ended. Not with celebration, but with an almost sacred quiet. For the Japanese women prisoners, the realization unfolded slowly, painfully. Surrender was more than defeat. It was the collapse of everything they had been raised to believe. From childhood, they had been taught that Japan was eternal, that the emperor was divine, that the nation could never fall. Yet now, his own voice had told them the opposite. The empire was finished. The invincible had been conquered. One of the women, a former nurse named Chio, began to sob quietly. She pressed her hand against her mouth, trying to keep the sound inside, but the tears came anyway. She wasn't crying out of fear of punishment or anger at the Americans. She was crying because something sacred inside her had died. Another woman, her hands trembling, whispered, "Makita, we've lost." The word tasted strange, forbidden, almost unreal. The Americans said nothing. They lowered their caps, turned away, and left the women to their grief. There was no victory in their expressions, only a kind of weary humanity. Some of them had lost brothers and friends in the Pacific. They, too, carried the weight of the war's cost. But what they all understood, standing in that humid morning air, was that the world had changed forever. For hours, the Japanese prisoners remained in the courtyard, not speaking, not moving. The only sounds were the distant cries of birds and the faint hum of the radio still playing static. A few women sank to their knees in the dirt, pressing their foreheads against the ground, not out of defiance, but mourning. The surrender was not only the end of the war, it was the end of identity, of pride, of the illusion that their suffering had meaning. Later, when the guards allowed them to return to the barracks, the women moved like shadows. Some sat by the windows, staring out at the clouds. Others clutched small keepsakes, a hair comb, a family photograph, a folded letter, the last fragments of the life they once knew. The radio still murmured faintly in the distance, now playing the voices of American broadcasters celebrating victory. But here, inside this small corner of the world, there was no celebration, only the quiet ache of understanding what the word surrender truly meant. In the following days, the camp atmosphere shifted in ways both visible and invisible. The guards grew gentler, their tones softer. The routines remained, but the tension had lifted. The Americans no longer looked at their prisoners as enemies. They looked at them as survivors, as human beings caught in the same tide of history. One morning, a guard handed out cigarettes to a few of the older prisoners. No words were exchanged, just a silent gesture, one that spoke more than any speech ever could. But for the women, the pain of realization deepened with each sunrise. They began to hear details about Hiroshima and Nagasaki from newly arriving reports, photographs of cities turned to dust, numbers of dead that defied comprehension. They had already known the bomb was powerful. Now they understood it was apocalyptic. In those moments, many began to wonder if Japan's surrender had been the only choice left. Even the most loyal among them could no longer imagine fighting against a weapon that erased entire cities in seconds. Chiyo, the nurse, found herself thinking of her home in Osaka. She remembered the nights when air raid sirens screamed through the city, when the skies glowed red and the sound of falling bombs never seemed to end. She had once believed those nights were the worst humanity could experience. But the atomic bomb had changed everything. It wasn't just another weapon. It was the end of the world made real. Some of the women tried to make sense of it through faith. Perhaps, one said softly, this is the God's way of humbling mankind. Another replied, perhaps it means there are no gods left at all. Their voices trailed off into silence. No one had answers anymore. The certainties of religion, nation, and destiny had all burned away in the light of that blinding flash. The Americans began to prepare the prisoners for release. The war was officially over. Repatriation would soon begin. Trucks arrived, carrying supplies, and the fences that once symbolized captivity now stood as reminders of what had been survived. Yet, as the women watched the preparations, few felt joy. The idea of returning home, to a country shattered, cities burned, families gone, filled them with more fear than relief. They were free, yes, but what world were they returning to? In the evenings, they often gathered near the wire fence and looked toward the horizon. The sky over Manila would darken into deep shades of violet and red as the sun set. Airplanes occasionally passed overhead. American bombers now flying not for destruction, but for transport and relief. The women watched them silently. The sound of the engines no longer meant death. It meant something else, a new world. One where the sky itself had become both the source of terror and the promise of renewal. As days passed, the radio broadcasts spoke of peace treaties, of occupation forces landing in Japan, of General MacArthur preparing to take command. The prisoners listened closely to one particular detail. The emperor himself would remain on the throne. This announcement caused a ripple of relief through the barracks. Though Japan had been defeated, the emperor's survival meant a fragment of the old world still existed. Yet deep inside, they knew he was no longer divine. He was now just a man who had witnessed the death of his empire. One night, after the camp lights were turned off, Chiyo walked outside. The air was cool and still. She looked up at the sky, the same sky that stretched above Japan. Somewhere far to the north, her homeland lay in ruins, but beneath that same sky she felt a strange calm. She thought of the word, impossible. For years, it had been used as a badge of pride. Japan could not be defeated, could not surrender, could not fall. Now the impossible had become truth. And yet, Within that truth was something fragile but enduring: survival. Against all odds, against all devastation, life had persisted. The war had proven humanity's capacity for destruction, but in that very destruction, there remained the faint spark of what might come next. In the days that followed, the women began to write again. Letters, journals, small notes to no one in particular. Some wrote prayers, others memories. They wrote not to be heard, but to remember, to give form to what they had endured. The guards sometimes found these pages left behind, folded carefully under pillows or hidden in cracks in the barracks' walls. They never threw them away. Perhaps they, too, felt that the words mattered, even if no one ever read them. When the trucks finally came to take them home, the women climbed aboard with quiet dignity. They didn't look back at the camp. There was nothing left to look at. Only the long road ahead, winding through a world that had changed beyond recognition. As the convoy moved out, an American guard raised his hand in farewell. One of the women nodded in return, a small gesture of shared humanity. The road was lined with palm trees, their leaves swaying in the morning breeze. The sound of the engines faded slowly into the distance, replaced by the soft hum of cicadas and the faint cry of seabirds. In the distance, an aircraft crossed the pale blue horizon. No one pointed at it. No one spoke. They simply watched, each lost in thought. It was no longer a symbol of fear, nor of dominance, but of the fragile balance between destruction and peace.